I'm Lidarga Velazi, and welcome to this week's Insider. Over 2,000 years ago, Haman, a royal advisor to the Persian king Ahasuerus, attempted to annihilate the Jewish people. His plans were ultimately thwarted by Queen Esther and her uncle Mordechai. This is the story of the Book of Esther, the story of Purim, a holiday in which Jews around the world celebrated this past week, celebrating their triumph over their attempted annihilation. This is an all too familiar story, one that's repeated itself throughout the centuries. Each time, though, the perpetrators, from the Persians to the Romans to the Nazis, failed, and the Jewish people continued to thrive. And it's impossible not to draw parallels to modern days, as Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, or modern-day Persia, all seek to annihilate the Jewish people once again. On October 7th, Hamas perpetrated one of the greatest massacres of Jews since the Holocaust. 134 hostages still remain in captivity in Gaza, and Israel finds itself once again in a war for its very survival, and Jews around the world are once again seeing the rising tides of anti-Semitism. And so, will these modern-day events be considered yet another triumph for the Jewish people? And are they once again left to cope with this evil alone in the world, as they've done for centuries? And that brings us to this week's events, the ongoing war, another failed hostages deal, mounting international pressure on Israel, and a UN Security Council resolution, which Israel's closest ally, the United States, failed to prevent. And joining us now to discuss all of this and more are Ari Harrow, former Chief of Staff for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Hillel Fold, tech guru and global speaker. Welcome, both of you. So just over 2,000 years of Jewish history to discuss today. Great to have you both on. Hillel, let's start with you. You wrote a very impassioned post on your social media platforms saying that the U.S. decision to abstain in the UN Security Council essentially could mark the beginning of the end for the U.S.-Israel special friendship, and even comparing King Ahasuerus from the Purim story to U.S. President Joe Biden. Can you expand on this for our viewers?
Sure. I mean, everyone's familiar with the phrase, history repeats itself, but few actually look at history books to know what's about to happen. And I think that that's a good way to evaluate our situation, to look throughout history, how things played out. And I believe the script is written already and it keeps repeating itself. And so what we're seeing today, obviously there's the play on words between Haman and Hamas. That's too easy. We got to get a little more complicated than that. And the truth is, those who are familiar with the story of Purim, we look at it, it's a celebration, maybe one of the happiest days of the calendar. And in reality, back then, if I had told you we're going to celebrate Purim one day, you would have thought I'm nuts, because that was the near genocide of the Jewish people. And, 127 provinces. This is world domination. This isn't just one country. Ahasuerus was basically the king of the world. And he agreed to annihilate the Jews. And, the story is the Jews, fasted and mourned. And then Esther became the queen and begged for her people, basically. And what's interesting is that someone pointed this out to me recently, that when Esther did indeed beg for her people, Ahasuerus didn't immediately say, okay, we're good, you're saved. He went to the backyard, so to speak, and contemplated what to do. Do I side with the Jews? Do I not side with the Jews? And I believe that's what's been happening. I wouldn't say from October 7th, because Biden was very pro-Israel for like a second and a half. But for the past few months, for sure, I believe that he was in the backyard contemplating. And I think that the decision showed its face yesterday in the UN, when it was a clear policy, change on behalf of the U.S. And some people like to belittle it and say, oh, it's not a big deal, but it is a big deal. It's not about the resolution. It's about the change in policy. And it seems very clear to me that Biden has made a choice. And I don't want to be, an alarmist and get too dramatic, but the reality is, again, look at the script. Every empire, it's the same thing. They grow, they come after the Jews, and that would be it's the end of them. I mean, like you mentioned some of them, but the list is very long. And all of those empires who came after the Jews all have one thing in common, and that's they're extinct. And listen, I grew up in the U.S., and I have a lot of gratitude to the U.S. They were great to my family. And the last thing I'd want to see is the U.S. falling. But again, it's a scary trend to see the United States administration turn against Israel that way. I don't want to get into the whole talk about anti-Semitism, but I do tell my friends in the U.S. that they should be reading the writing on the wall. Unfortunately, the writing is very clear.
That's a very interesting analysis. Now, Ari, turning to you, Israel is clearly reacting harshly to the U.S. failure to veto the resolution. Prime Minister Netanyahu canceling a planned delegation to the U.S., but the U.S. officials say that they're perplexed. They don't see this as a diplomatic crisis. They say, contrary to what Hillel's just said, they don't see any change in U.S. policy. saying that even the U.S. even intervened on Israel's behalf to ensure that a call for the release of the hostages was included. So what's your take on this? Do you agree with Hillel? I mean, is this really the diplomatic disaster that, that Hillel says it is?
So I think that there's two elements that really have to be touched upon. First of all, from a diplomatic perspective, the only measuring stick that you really need is how did Hamas respond to the decision in the UN Security Council? And they celebrated it. Now, Hamas is a recognized terrorist organization, not just in Israel, but in the United States of America and in most of the EU countries as well. So if a terrorist organization that perpetrated, as you said earlier, Lidar, the worst massacre in the history of the state of Israel, is celebrating a decision made by the UN Security Council, then by definition, it's not just bad for Israel, it's bad for Western civilization. And that should be enough for us to understand the direction that those countries are headed in. Now, one point that I do want to, I guess not differ from Hillel, but because I'm a very big believer in patterns of history and following history. But I think that there is something in the United States that's a little bit different, and we have to remind ourselves of it, and we have to be conscious of it in our diplomatic engagements and in our efforts to explain ourselves. In polling throughout the war that we've been fighting in Gaza, polling in the United States has consistently been pro-Israel, meaning the majority of American citizens still understand the difference between good and evil, between right and wrong. And it is those people that we need to not only connect with, but we need to leverage in our dealings with the government of the United States. I think that for various reasons, and they've been very public, the Biden administration has taken a turn for the worse. They've adopted policies that not only are detrimental to Israel, but are detrimental to the United States and to the West in general. But we need to remember and we need to grasp the fact that the people of the United States, obviously the Jewish communities, the pro-Israel evangelical communities, and many, many others, still support our right and understand that we are the victims of October 7th, and all we're doing is protecting our women and children, and we want our hostages back. And I think that ultimately that we need to stay the course.
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple. Speaking of the hostages, and Ari, you mentioned Hamas praising the UN vote. So Hillel, the same day of the UN vote, Hamas suddenly announces it's sticking to its demands and rejecting yet another offer for a deal. Do you also see this as a direct result of the U.S.'s actions in the Security Council?
Oh, 100%. And again, I don't think Hamas is hiding it. I think they stated it pretty clearly. Like Ari said, show me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are, right? I mean, when Hamas is backing up your decision, you should be asking yourself some serious questions. And so, of course, they think their kind of strategy here is that, the world's going to pressure Israel not to go into Rafah, which I hope and pray that, our officials withstand that pressure and do enter Rafah, because you don't put out 75% of a fire. It's just silly. And so I think, they are banking on the fact that the world is going to pressure Israel. And this resolution is just kind of the beginning. And America abstaining is, from their perspective, a huge deal, because now no one has our back. And, I think, listen, rule number one when you're on a panel is create controversy. So I'm going to create a little controversy. I love Ari. He's the best, and he's a mentor to me. But I disagree, and I'll tell you why I disagree. Of course, right now in the United States, we have overwhelming, support, and most of America does stand by us. There's no question about that. And of course, one cannot compare, the United States 2024 to, Germany 1945. I'm not, God forbid, making that comparison. But you also need to see the writing on the wall. In other words, yes, right now we have that support, but what's the trend? Which direction are we going, right? And, I understand that social media is not a reflection of reality. I get that. And, the algorithms are built for extremism. I get it. But if I'm going to take an anecdotal, just data from my personal social media, it's a pretty scary situation out there. And I'm not saying, billions of people writing me. It's not about that. It's the things that people are saying, the things that people are believing, and the things that are being, disseminated by the mainstream media. I mean, just 2 days ago, Al Jazeera put out a report that IDF soldiers raped Palestinian women. And of course, immediately, all the press picked it up. 2 days later, they said, oh, by the way, that was not real. That was fake news. Great. The damage is already done. And the world believes it. And some of the things that people are saying to me on social media are just literally hard to believe. So it's true that we have the support of the American public right now. But unfortunately, from where I'm sitting, it's headed in a bad direction.
Armin, do you agree with that assessment? Is this a rift that the U.S. and Israel will be able to overcome, do you think? Or are relations now entirely frayed, and especially moving forward?
So I don't disagree with Hillel. I think that there's an element of short-term versus long-term. And with regard to the current conflict, we've had conflicts with the United States before. Some have been, more intense, some have been less intense. Historically, if you go back to pretty much every single military conflict that Israel has had since 1948, including 1948, we've had our problems with the international community, including the United States. So there's nothing that is not par for the course when it comes to that. Having said that, there is a deeper issue at hand here, and that is, how is the West going to deal with this type of treacherous fundamentalism that brings about massacres against innocent democratic civilizations? Something that I tend to tell groups that I speak to is that Israel is nothing but an excuse for the West. And if you take Israel out of the equation, God forbid, let's say that Israel disappeared from the map. We didn't exist anymore. What would the United States want to do with Hamas then? What would they want to do with Iran then? What would they want to do with Hezbollah then? Would they ignore it? Would they hope and pray that they turn the Middle East into a modern technological miracle? I doubt it. And Israel, therefore, just becomes an excuse for a real problem that the West needs to wake up to. Because as Hillel said, it's not just about what happens in Nir Oz or in Sderot. At some point, that's going to be on the shores of every Western civilization in the world if we don't deal with it.
Very well said. And I want to circle back to something that you talked about earlier, and that was the military operation in Rafah. We're still in the middle of a war. Hillel, you also called for Israel to enter Rafah already last night after the vote. And I want to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, do you think this could potentially be a diplomatic mistake? I mean, Israel could risk losing all international support, and if so, what then?
Well, I can answer you as, let's call it, a political analyst, or I can answer you as Hillel Folt, right? Politically and diplomatically, we're in for a rough ride if we do enter Rafah. On a personal level, I think it's time we jumped in the water, and again, I don't mean to get too biblical on you, but, the way I see it, again, it's just the same script repeating itself. And I view us right now at the splitting of the Red Sea. We got to jump in. And it's time that we stop being so dependent on the United States because this is the result. Now, again, that's not an easy thing to do. We need those F-35s. We need that ammunition. I'm not pretending or belittling the effort of that breakup, but I think it's necessary. And again, we're seeing why right now. So, I think we need to do what we need to do. I think, not only do I think that the United States at the end of the day, won't truly, quote unquote, break up with us. I actually think that Biden's obviously doing what he's doing because of, the upcoming elections. And I think he has to say what he has to say. But at the end of the day, when Israel goes into Rafah, I can't see Biden really getting in our way because everyone understands that, it is completely necessary. There's no middle ground here. It's not gray. It's black and white. Either we win the war or we lose the war. And if we're not in Rafah where, the vast majority of Hamas terrorists are hiding right now, then we've lost the war. And I don't think anyone has any doubts about what the next step will be once Israel loses the war, like Ari said. And, there was a funny, I guess it's not so funny, but a meme going around about, the horrible, horrible, tragic attack in Moscow 2 days ago saying, why don't we apply the same standards to them? Like free ISIS, let's send in some humanitarian aid to ISIS. Like the double standard is just staggering. But when you see it in an event, like right in front of your eyes at the same time, simultaneously as this war is going on and that happens, and the double standard that the world applies, it's unbelievable to see. So the bottom line, just to kind of sum up my opinion here, we need to do what we need to do. We need to go in there. Otherwise, we will lose this war. And again, like Ari said, the West is next. It's not going to be easy diplomatically, but there is no other choice.
Mm-hmm. And
Lidar, if
yeah,
you don't mind me just adding one comment to that, because I
go
think
ahead.
it's important that we project. It's important that we project the wall-to-wall unity in Israel on this issue. If you go to polling in Israel, should Israel finish off the Hamas, including in Rafah, from left to right and right to left, there is complete unity on this issue. There could be tactical differences as to who and when and why it gets done, but there is no debate whatsoever in Israel. And the artificial attempt to turn this into a Netanyahu issue by the international community, including the United States, is a falsehood when you talk to the people in Israel. And that is something that needs to be projected and needs to be conveyed to the international community.
And it's an absolute consensus for sure here in Israel. And Ari, I also want to circle back to the hostages. You know, Hamas clearly believing it now has no need to negotiate, as you've said. So where does that leave the hostages, and what choices is Israel left with in order to bring them back home?
We need to remember, and the international community needs to remember, that the other side of this equation is a ruthless, murderous, treacherous terrorist organization. And therefore, this isn't negotiating over a piece of land or some type of business deal. This is the real world. And the only understanding that Hamas can have, the only thing that will bring Hamas to the table, and we all want to see all the hostages home today, not tomorrow. We want them back immediately. They will only understand true pressure, military pressure, that can collapse what's left of their capabilities, and only then will they be in a position where they're open to seriously negotiating. I think that Israel made tremendous inroads. And I think that if you look at the initial hostage exchange that took place, it was a result of a very clear and very strong campaign that was being run against Hamas, first and foremost by Israel's military, and secondly by the international community. I think that what they have seen since then is the international community and our closest allies changing direction. And at the same time, the fact that we have not gone into Rafah, we haven't held our boot to their neck, has allowed them to falsely believe that there is going to be a day after from their perspective. We need to remove that dream from their head, and we need to make sure that if they feel that their end is near, only then will they return to the negotiating table in a way that will bring our hostages home.
And Hilla, would you agree with that assessment? Because it really does seem that now Hamas sort of holds, the cards, and they seem to be having or enjoying some sort of support from the international community. So what's your assessment of that?
I mean, again, I just want to, emphasize what Ari said. We have to remember who we're talking about here. The fact that I got to be honest with you, on October 8th, I sat, crying and said to myself, if there's any silver lining here, it's that the world is going to stand by our side. There's no scenario with, HD GoPro footage and Hamas boasting about what they did. There is no scenario that the world doesn't stand with us. I mean, what, the world's going to stand with pedophiles and rapists? Clearly not. And here we are. It's mind-boggling how any human being with a heart, with a conscience, can stand by Hamas, right? But that's the world we live in, and it's a crazy thing. And so, on the one hand, of course, we always need to take the world into consideration. But when there's a clear conflict between what we need to do as a country and what the world wants us to do, we have to choose our best interests. And the only way, like Ari said, to defeat Hamas, this kind of, horrible, barbaric organization, is military power. If one Hamas terrorist is left standing, from their perspective, they won. Which, that obviously shouldn't impact our definition of victory. We need to do what we need to do. But there is no negotiating with rapists and pedophiles. There is no negotiation. We need to do what we need to do, military power. And I'm going to say, on a personal level, it does scare me. Of course it scares me, because there is somewhat of a, contradiction between our two objectives in this war. I mean, let's be honest here, right? To defeat Hamas completely means that, unfortunately, we're going to lose hostages. But if we're negotiating with Hamas to get our hostages back, then we're not defeating Hamas. So it's a little bit of a mutually exclusive situation, which begs the question, who came up with these war objectives? That's a whole different discussion. The reality is, yes, Hamas will only understand military pressure, and we should not be holding back because some foreign government doesn't like, the optics of made-up, fabricated numbers, and somehow the world just accepts numbers given by an actual terrorist organization. This script, I have to say, I couldn't even write the script. If I came to a production company with this script and I said, here's a movie, they would say, come back with the realistic script. You couldn't make this stuff up.
So, Ari, turning back to you, we've been very pessimistic in our discussion so far, and also the sort of this bleak future that you've sort of painted for us with, the West is next. Maybe give us a bit of hope, an optimistic note, perhaps.
I actually am extremely optimistic because I do believe that Israel has no choice but to win this war, and I've maintained that from day number one, that there is no reality where we do not finish Hamas. And the reason that makes me optimistic is because that does, on behalf of the Western world, we send a message to the powers that be, to terrorist organizations, that we will not sit back and we're not going to bend and we're not going to break. And I think that if you look at the region that we live in, just as an example, the fact that we have been able to reach peace accords with some of our Arab neighbors in the region, with Muslim countries like the UAE, like Bahrain, like Morocco, just shows you that a strong Israel is an Israel that people want to connect with, they want to do business with, they want to become allies with. And I think that the outcome of victory is an outcome that will expand the peace in the region and will be better for the world. So being that that is the only outcome that I foresee, I actually think that the ripple effect will be extremely positive for the region and for the world.
And Hillel, I do want to circle back to the comparison of Purim. Do you believe that just as history has repeated itself over and over, especially with regards to the Jewish people, that it will once again do so now and that the Jewish people will emerge victorious, as Ari has said?
I don't think there's any doubt. We started off with history repeats itself. Well, we know the end of the story, right? And it's a happy ending, at least for us, not so much for the other countries. And so, yeah, I'm 100% optimistic, and I have been from day one. As an observant Jew, I can't help but see God, everywhere in this war. From the big question of why does the world even care about this war? What's the obsession? Clearly, it's not the casualty numbers because they're microscopic compared to other conflicts. So why does the world even care? And how do all these rockets, 20,000 rockets or whatever the number is right now, fall into empty spaces? So these are miracles. I see God in the entire war from beginning to end. And like I said, we know the ending. It's going to be a positive one. The big question is, how much pain and suffering we have to go through to get to that ending. But I only have optimism for the outcome of this war. And again, like Ari said, this war is just the first step in defeating radical Islam. And I want to be very clear. I don't think anybody in their right mind would say that all Muslims are terrorists. That's but the reality is we're talking about hundreds of millions of people, 10, 15, whatever percent of Islam are fundamentalists. So 200, 300, whatever number it is, that is a lot of people dedicated to the destruction of Western civilization. That cannot be belittled. That's a lot of people. And so this needs to be dealt with, and we need to nip it in the bud right now. And if Israel doesn't do it, like we keep saying, the West is next, but that's what Israel's going to do. That's what Israel has to do. And the outcome and the ending will be a good one.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you to our guests, Ari Harrow and Hillel Fold, and thank you to our viewers for watching. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to follow ILTV on all our platforms. Thanks for watching.